The dust had not yet settled from the last wagon when Olive Atwood stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and every man on the main street stopped moving except for one, and that one was the only man large enough that his stopping would have mattered. She did not mean to take notice of him before she noticed the town, or the smell of horse and sawdust and sun-baked earth, or the way the wind off the plains hit her square in the chest like something alive. But he was simply impossible to miss, and it was not only his size, though the size was considerable. He stood at the edge of the boardwalk outside the general store with a sack of feed over one shoulder that would have buckled most men at both knees. And when Olive stepped off the stage and her traveling trunk clattered to the ground and tumbled sideways into the street, the men nearest to her laughed or looked away or simply waited to see what a woman alone would do about it. John Ashford set down his feed sack, crossed the street in 4 strides, and righted her trunk before she had finished bending toward it. He did not make a performance of it. He did not linger for a thank you. He lifted the trunk, set it on the boardwalk beside her, tipped his hat with one broad, calloused hand, and stepped off the walkway so she could pass without going around him. That was the thing she could not stop thinking about for the rest of the day, and then the day after that, and then many days beyond those. Every other man in 3 territories apparently needed the entire width of whatever road or room or conversation he occupied. John Ashford, who was built like something quarried rather than born, moved out of her way before she even had to ask. She noticed it before she noticed anything else about him, and it told her more than a month of courtship could have told her about any other man. Olive Atwood had come to Caldwell for reasons that were practical, and that she did not feel the need to apologize for. She was 26 years old. She had $340 sewn into the lining of that overturned trunk, and she had a letter from a man named Gerald Prentice, who operated the only dry goods establishment in town, and who had advertised in an Abilene newspaper for a woman with bookkeeping experience to manage his accounts. She had that experience. She had worked 4 years in her father's hardware store in Ohio before her father died and her uncle sold it out from under her. And she had come west not because she was romantic about the frontier, but because the frontier was the only place left in 1878 where a woman with skills and no husband could still find room to stand on her own 2 feet. She picked up her traveling bag, set her hat straight against the wind, and looked around for someone who could direct her to the hotel. A woman in a brown dress was watching her from the doorway of a millinery shop. She had kind eyes and sharp cheekbones and the kind of still watchfulness that belongs to people who have seen enough of the world to wait before forming opinions. "You looking for the Continental?" the woman called. "If that is the hotel, yes ma'am," Olive said. "It is the only thing in Caldwell that calls itself a hotel. Come on, I will walk you. I am Nora Fitch. I run the millinery and do not apologize for either." "Olive Atwood," Olive said and fell into step beside her. "You here for Prentice's position?" Nora asked. "I am." "Good. His accounts are a disaster and he knows it, and he will be relieved to hand them to someone who is not him." Nora held open the door to the Continental, which smelled of pine resin and old smoke, and something that might have been beef stew at some point in its recent history. "You will want the room at the back. The front rooms face the cattle pens, and I will warn you now, that is a smell that does not improve with familiarity." Olive took the room at the back. She lay awake that first night listening to the wind scrape against the window pane and the distant sound of something being argued about in one of the saloons, and she thought about Ohio and did not miss it. She thought about the $340 and what it would take to supplement her income from Prentice's wages and turn it into something that might eventually become her own establishment. She thought, briefly and against her will, about the man who had righted her trunk and the specific quiet of his courtesy. She told herself she was tired and went to sleep. Gerald Prentice was exactly the kind of man Olive had expected him to be, which was to say he was harried and apologetic, and had a mustache that drooped with the weight of his general anxiety. He met her at 8 in the morning, walked her through the storeroom and the front floor and the back office, and then placed in front of her a ledger book so thoroughly tangled with errors that she had to press her fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathe evenly for a moment before she could speak. "I see," she said. "I have been meaning to sort it for some time," Prentice said. "Clearly," Olive said. "Can you fix it?" She pulled the ledger toward her, smoothed the open page flat with her palm, and picked up a pencil. "Come back in 3 hours." He came back in 4, by which time she had identified 6 duplicate entries, 2 missing columns of inventory, and a debt to a hardware supplier in Wichita that had been entered as an asset for the better part of 8 months. Prentice looked at her summary with the expression of a man who has just been told his horse has a broken leg, but the bullet has been found and removed. "I will need full access to the past 3 years of ledgers," she said. "And a second pencil. This one is nearly gone." "Yes, of course, anything you need." He paused. "You are very thorough, Miss Atwood. That is what you hired me for, Mr. Prentice." It took her 2 weeks to bring his accounts into order. Within that time, she had also reorganized his inventory system, discovered that his primary supplier in Wichita was overcharging him on dry goods by approximately 12%, and drafted a letter to said supplier that was polite, specific, and left no room for misunderstanding. Prentice read the letter twice, and then asked her to also handle his correspondence going forward. She said yes, and asked for an additional $2 a week. He agreed without negotiating, which told her she probably could have asked for 3. The town itself took some getting used to, and Caldwell in 1878 was not a gentle place for the adjustment. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, and the cattle drives that passed through it brought with them every kind of man in every kind of mood, and the saloons on the lower end of Main Street were never fully quiet and were sometimes considerably louder than that. The town had a marshal, a man named Cobb, who wore his badge like an afterthought and spent considerable time in the Continental's dining room eating someone else's supper, and a deputy who was young and serious and seemed to take his responsibilities genuinely to heart, even when the town made it difficult. Olive learned quickly which streets to take and which hours to take them, and she was not afraid exactly, but she was careful, and she understood the difference between those 2 things. She saw John Ashford again on a Thursday morning in her 2nd week, outside the livery stable at the east end of town. He was working on a wagon wheel with a competence that was beautiful in the purely mechanical sense, the kind of focused, practiced motion that makes a difficult thing look easy. He was even larger than she had remembered, or perhaps the open street had simply not given her the frame of reference the livery yard provided. He stood 6 feet 4 inches if he stood an inch, and the width of his shoulders blocked the morning sun enough that a stripe of shadow fell across the ground behind him. He looked up as she passed. She nodded. He nodded back. She went on. That evening, Nora Fitch appeared at the door of the Continental with 2 cups of coffee that she had clearly carried across the street from her own establishment, and Olive let her in, and they sat on the narrow porch at the back of the hotel and watched the light go out over the plains. "You have been here 2 weeks, Nora said. "What have you made of the place?" "It is rougher than I expected," Olive said. "But there is more going on beneath it than shows on the surface." "That is true of most things. What about the people?" "Most of them are still deciding what to make of me," Olive said, "which is fair. I'm still deciding what to make of most of them." Nora smiled. She had a way of smiling that suggested she knew more than she said, and Olive appreciated that quality in a person. She had grown up around talkers and had developed an early affection for the ones who chose their words. "What do you know about John Ashford?" Olive asked, and then regretted that she had, because she could feel Nora's attention shift with the specificity of a compass needle finding north. "Why do you ask?" "He was kind to me the day I arrived. I was curious about him." "John Ashford," Nora said, and sipped her coffee slowly. "He ranches about 12 miles out on the Northwest Road, has about 400 head of cattle, and runs the property alone since his father passed 3 years back. His mother lives in Wichita with his sister. He comes into town every 2 weeks or so for supplies. He is 31. He was briefly engaged to a woman named Clara Hensley 2 years ago, but she went back east before the wedding took place, and the general understanding is that she could not abide the isolation, though Clara told different stories to different people depending on the day. Olive absorbed this information and kept her face neutral. He is not a saloon man, Nora added. Does not gamble, does not cause trouble. Men who want to start something with him generally reconsider once they have gotten a good look at him, and the ones who do not generally regret the decision. He seems quiet, Olive said. He is. The quiet ones are the interesting ones. Nora stood up and collected the empty cups. Come to supper on Sunday. I make a decent roast, and I want someone to argue with about things that matter. I accept, Olive said. Sunday's supper at Nora's house behind the millinery was a revelation. There were 4 others: the town's schoolteacher, a woman named Helen Marsh who had strong opinions about everything and stated them with the calm certainty of someone accustomed to being right, a rancher named Bill Cord whose wife had died of fever 2 winters prior, and who ate with the concentrated gratitude of a man who rarely had a meal set before him, and 2 brothers from a neighboring property who were still young enough to be embarrassed by the fact that they had come to supper on the recommendation of their mother, and John Ashford, who arrived with his hat in his hands and a jar of something preserved that he set on the table without comment. He took the chair at the far end of the table, which happened to be directly across from the chair Nora gestured Olive toward, and for a brief and terrible moment Olive had the sensation that Nora Fitch had arranged this with a degree of intentionality that was either kind or devious, and possibly both. The conversation was good. Helen Marsh wanted to discuss the new schoolhouse being built at the edge of town and whether the county could be persuaded to fund additional books. The Cord rancher had opinions about the spring cattle prices. The 2 young brothers from the neighboring property were mostly concerned with eating and contributing occasional commentary that made the table laugh. John Ashford spoke sparingly, and when he did it was worth listening to. He had a voice that was lower than his size required, measured and unhurried, and once when Helen Marsh made a sharp remark about the way the railroad was pricing out the smaller ranchers, he set down his fork and looked at her with an expression of quiet seriousness and said, "She is right about that. The rates they set last fall will bankrupt at least 3 operations I know of by the end of the year if something does not change. I have written to the territory representative twice, and I will write again." Helen Marsh looked at him with a satisfaction that suggested she was pleased to have her opinions validated by someone unlikely to be argued down. Olive watched him over her coffee cup at the end of the meal and tried to locate the source of her interest in him, which was considerable and which she was honest enough to acknowledge rather than politely ignore. It was not only that he had moved out of her way, though that remained significant. It was that every action she had observed from him since bore out the same quality, a consideration for the space he took up and the weight he put on the world around him. A man that large, she had found in her experience, often leaned on that fact. He used it as currency, as leverage, as permission to occupy more than his share of whatever room he was in. John Ashford moved through the world as if the largeness were a responsibility he was trying to carry gracefully, rather than an advantage he was eager to press. She found that unreasonably affecting. He caught her watching him when he stood to help clear the plates, and he did not look away quickly or pretend he hadn't noticed. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, not shy, not bold. Something in between that acknowledged something had been observed on both sides without making a declaration about what that meant. Then he picked up the stack of plates and carried them to the kitchen. She walked home that night through the blue dark with Nora beside her, and Nora said nothing about any of it, which Olive appreciated almost as much as the dinner. The following week a problem arrived at the general store in the shape of a man named Dolan Hatch, who represented himself as a supplier from Dodge City, and who wanted Prentice to sign a new contract for staple goods at rates that were, upon Olive's examination, laughably disadvantageous. "You would be replacing your current supplier," she told Prentice when Hatch had been politely asked to wait outside. "Your current supplier, once we renegotiate the existing 12% overcharge, will still be 20% cheaper than what this contract offers. Hatch says he can guarantee delivery year-round even through the winter months," Prentice said. "Your current supplier has delivered year-round for 3 consecutive winters as shown in your own records," Olive said. "I have read them." Prentice tugged at his mustache. "Hatch is also, I should mention, somewhat known to Marshal Cobb." Olive understood what that meant without requiring elaboration. She had been in Caldwell long enough. "Then you should know," she said evenly, "that if you sign this contract and I am recording your accounts, this office will have a very clear paper record of exactly what you paid and when and to whom and whether the goods delivered matched the invoice. That record will be available to anyone who asks." Prentice looked at her for a long moment. "Send Hatch away," she said. "Write to Wichita this afternoon." He sent Hatch away. Olive walked home feeling the particular satisfaction of having done a thing well, and she was so occupied with it that she rounded the corner at the end of Main Street and very nearly walked directly into John Ashford, who was coming in the opposite direction with a newspaper tucked under his arm and a paper-wrapped parcel in one hand. He stopped immediately. He was wearing a coat today, darker than the sun-worn denim he usually worked in, and his hair was slightly damp at the temples as if he had recently washed up, and she had a strong and inconvenient awareness of all of this at once. "Miss Atwood," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "I apologize. I was not watching where I was going." "No harm done." He tilted his head slightly. "Are you well? You looked like you were in the middle of something serious." It surprised her that he asked. It surprised her more that he seemed to mean it. "I was thinking about supplier contracts and whether honest bookkeeping can function as a form of protection," she said. He considered this. "I think it can," he said, "if the person keeping the books has the stomach for what that means." "I do," she said. "I believe that," he said simply, and the simplicity of it was better than any elaborate compliment could have been. They stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the late afternoon sun making long shadows down the street. "I enjoyed Sunday supper," he said. "As did I," she said. "Nora sets a good table. And good company." He looked at her again with that same unreadable expression that was neither shy nor bold but something more honest than either. Then he said, "I have some business to settle at the telegraph office, but I wonder if you might be agreeable to walking on Sunday after church, if you attend the service." Olive felt something turn over quietly in her chest, like a page being turned to find that the next one is more interesting than expected. "I do attend," she said, "and I would be agreeable." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and continued down the street with the paper parcel under one arm and the newspaper under the other, and she watched him go for longer than was strictly necessary before continuing toward the Continental. She did not tell Nora about the invitation. She suspected Nora already knew. The Sunday walk happened on a morning of early June, when the sky above the Kansas plains was the kind of blue that makes you feel the world is larger than you have been giving it credit for. They walked out along the road east of town, which was quieter than the cattle road, and ran alongside a shallow creek that had cottonwoods growing along its banks, their leaves turning and flashing in the light. John Ashford walked beside her at a measured pace, neither rushing nor making her feel as if he were slowing himself for her benefit, and she thought again about how deliberate his physical awareness of himself was. He had left a courteous distance between them that acknowledged the situation without being formal about it, and when the path narrowed near the creek bank, he dropped back half a step so she could pass without having to press close, and it was such a small and natural thing that she almost did not notice, and then she noticed completely. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" he asked. "Coming on 6 weeks. What do you think of it now that you have had time to look at it properly?" "I think it is harder and more honest than most places I have been," she said, The hardness and the honesty seemed to be connected. "That is a good way to put it," he said. "I grew up in Texas, originally. Came north when my father got the land here. Texas has the hardness but not always the honesty. Ohio has the honesty but not the hardness," she said. "Or not as much of it. I think I prefer this ratio." He smiled at that. The smile changed his face in a way she was not prepared for. The rest of him was substantial and serious, and the smile was unexpected, not broad but genuine, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. "What brought you to Ohio?" he asked. "I was born there," she said. "What brought you here, finally, specifically to Caldwell?" "The land was good and the price was right, and I needed room to build something that was mine," he said. "My father and I had different opinions about how to run things, and when he died and left the property to me, the first feeling I had was grief, and the second was that I finally had the chance to do it the way I thought it should be done. That is a hard thing to admit." She looked at him sideways. "It is an honest thing," she said. "That is not the same as a hard thing, even if it feels that way sometimes." He thought about this. They were at the bank of the creek now, the cottonwood shade making patterns on the water, and he sat down on a flat stone and she sat on another not far away, and for a while they watched the creek without talking, and the silence was the kind that does not require filling. "Nora tells me you sorted out Prentice's accounts in 2 weeks," he said eventually. "3, technically. She said you also found a fraudulent supplier and got rid of him." "I found a disadvantageous contract and advised my employer to decline it," she said. "That is what bookkeeping is for. That is not what most people think bookkeeping is for. Most people think bookkeeping is for counting," she said. "It is also for knowing. Numbers tell you everything about a situation if you know how to ask them the right questions." He was looking at her with an attention that felt different from being watched. It felt like being considered, carefully and without haste, and she returned the attention honestly and found that what she saw in his face was a person. Not a large person or an impressive person or a useful person, but a specific, particular person who had a way of listening that made you feel the thing you had just said mattered. She thought she might be in some trouble. He walked her back to the Continental before noon and said goodbye at the door with the same courtesy that had defined every interaction she had observed from him, and she went inside and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall for a while and thought very carefully about what she was doing. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly. She had watched her mother make quick decisions and spend a lifetime paying for them. She believed in looking at a thing from all angles before committing to a direction, and she intended to do exactly that here. But she was honest with herself, which was her most useful quality, and the honest assessment was this. She had been in Caldwell 6 weeks, and she had thought about John Ashford almost every day for at least 5 of them, and the walk this morning had done nothing to reduce that number. The summer deepened, and the cattle drives brought their chaos through town on a rolling, unpredictable schedule, and Olive's days settled into a rhythm that was demanding and satisfying. She had reorganized Prentice's entire operation by early July and had begun to develop a secondary income of her own by taking on the accounts for 2 other businesses on Main Street. The hardware store, which was run by a taciturn man named Garrett who trusted numbers and very little else, and the millinery, which was Nora's, and which Nora had asked Olive to handle primarily because she trusted no one else in town with her books. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape the way a building takes shape, one solid thing placed on top of another solid thing, until the structure begins to suggest what it will eventually become. John Ashford came to town every 2 weeks, and they walked on Sundays when he was there and wrote letters between his visits, which had not been a plan exactly but had become one naturally, the way real plans usually do. His letters were not what she had expected. She had expected practicality, a cattle man's letters, accounting for weather and stock prices and the condition of the land. There was some of that. But there was also observation and thought, and a dry, careful humor that she had suspected existed somewhere inside his quietness, and was pleased to find confirmed in writing. She wrote back with equal care and with more of herself than she had offered to anyone in years, and she was aware that she was doing it and did not stop. On a Saturday in late July, a situation arose at the general store that required John Ashford's presence in ways she had not anticipated. A group of men driving cattle through from Texas had taken exception to the prices Prentice was charging for the feed they needed, and the argument had moved past words and into the territory of a man with a knife handle, gripped in one hand, standing in the middle of a store and daring anyone to disagree with him. Olive had been in the back office when it started. She came through the door to find Prentice pressed against the far wall, and the man with the knife talking loudly about what he intended to do to the next person who suggested his estimate of a fair price was incorrect. She assessed the situation quickly and made the calculation that speaking would make things worse before it made them better, and so she stood very still near the doorway and hoped for a development. The development was John Ashford, who had been outside at the hitching post when the shouting started, and who came through the front door with neither urgency nor hesitation, and the room changed the moment he entered it. He was simply very large, and he was calm, and those two things together produced a particular effect on the man with the knife, who found himself looking up at someone whose width and quietness combined to suggest that shouting and knife handles were somewhat beside the point. "I believe there is a disagreement about prices," John said, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything. The knife man looked at him. "You representing this store?" "No," John said. "I am a customer who would like to complete his business without interruption. What is the price in dispute?" The argument was sorted within 15 minutes, partly because John negotiated a reasonable middle ground with the patience of someone who had done this before, and partly because the knife man seemed to find it difficult to sustain his outrage in the presence of someone that large who showed no sign of being impressed by it. The men left. Prentice straightened his coat with shaking hands. Olive came out from near the doorway. "Thank you," Prentice said to John. "I wanted my flour," John said, and went back to the counter. Olive looked at him for a moment and then went back to the office and sat down and put her hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully. She was not frightened. She had assessed the situation and found it manageable, but the sight of him walking through that door with such complete, unperformed composure had done something to her composure that she was not entirely prepared for. That evening she walked to the telegraph office and sent a letter to her aunt in Columbus, which was not something she did often, and in it she wrote, "I think I may be falling in love with someone, and I am not certain what to do about it except continue to be honest and see what happens." Her aunt wrote back 3 weeks later and said, "That sounds exactly right. Be honest and be patient, and do not make it into something complicated when it is only love." She was not going to make it complicated. The moment it stopped being complicated came on an evening in August when John Ashford came to town on a Wednesday instead of his usual schedule, which she noticed because she had come to know his schedule without meaning to. And he knocked on the door of the Continental and asked for her, and she came downstairs to find him standing in the entryway with his hat in both hands and an expression that was the least composed she had ever seen on him, which still meant it was more composed than most people's careful presentations, but she could see the difference. "I have something to say," he said. She looked at him and felt the whole thing settle in her chest with the weight of something that had been waiting long enough. "All right," she said. "I would like to say it somewhere other than the hotel entryway if you are willing." She took her shawl from the hook by the door and they walked out into the warm August evening, and they went to the small park at the center of town that had a bench and 2 trees, and the remains of a garden that some optimistic person had planted the previous spring. They sat on the bench. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the park toward the edge of town, where the lights of the saloons were beginning to show in the darkening air, and then he looked at his hands, and then he looked at her. "I am not a man who speaks his feelings easily," he said. I have been told this is a flaw, and I have been told it is a virtue, and I think the truth is it is neither. It is just how I am built. But I have been thinking about you since March, and I have thought about you every day since May, and I am not by nature someone who ignores something that's significant. So I need to say directly that I would very much like to know if this is a thing that might have a future for both of us. Olive looked at him and felt something open in her that had been closed for a long time, not painfully closed but carefully so, the way you close a window against whether you are not certain about. I have been thinking about you since March as well, she said. He let out a long breath. It was the most undone she had ever seen him. I am not a woman who makes quick decisions, she said. And I would want to be honest with you about the life I am building here. I am not looking for someone to provide for me. I am building my own practice, and I intend to continue that regardless of my personal circumstances. I would not want you to stop, he said immediately, and the immediacy of it was everything. I have watched you work for 5 months, and the idea of you stopping would be the same as asking a river to stop running. It would just make a mess of the landscape. She laughed, which surprised her, and the laugh seemed to surprise him too. And then he smiled, that full, unexpected smile that started in his eyes, and the evening air between them was suddenly lighter than it had been. Then I think it has a future, she said, if you are patient and I am honest, which I expect both of us to be. I can promise patient, he said. I believe you about honest. They sat for a while longer in the warm dark, not touching but close, the sounds of the town moving around them like water around stones, and Olive thought that this was what she had been building toward, this quiet, solid thing, and it seemed right. He came to town every week after that. The autumn of 1878 in Caldwell was a complicated season. The last of the big cattle drives came through in September, and the town was loud and crowded, and Olive worked longer hours because the increased traffic meant increased business for every establishment she kept accounts for. There were nights she fell asleep at her desk in Prentice's back office and woke to find that someone had placed a blanket over her shoulders, and she suspected it was Prentice himself, which revised her opinion of him upward. She and John moved from walking to longer afternoons together, sitting at Nora's table or at the Continental's small dining room or, on 2 occasions, riding out to the ranch so she could see the land he had built his life on. It was beautiful in the way that large, empty things are beautiful, not gentle but true, the grass going gold in the autumn light, the sky moving above it with a depth that made you feel small in the most clarifying way. He showed her the house he had built with his father before his father's health declined. It was solid and plainly made, and it had a porch that faced west so the sunsets came to you directly and without apology. There was a kitchen with a large iron stove, and a sitting room with a bookshelf that was more full than she had expected, and she ran her fingers along the spines and noted the titles and felt she was reading a kind of autobiography. "You read a great deal," she said. "The winters here are long," he said, "and I like thinking about things I have not thought about before." She pulled a volume of essays by Emerson from the shelf and held it up. "Did this change how you thought about anything?" "It changed how I thought about self-reliance," he said. "I had always thought of it as a virtue of isolation. After reading it, I thought of it more as a virtue of integrity. You can be self-reliant in the middle of a community if you are being honest about who you are." She put the book back on the shelf and looked at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just noticing things." By October they had reached the understanding, without formal declaration, that they were building something together. It was not announced and it was not performed, but Nora knew and the town suspected, and the 2 young brothers from the neighboring ranch had apparently bet on it months ago, which Olive found out about at a Sunday supper, and found she did not mind. On an evening in October, a situation arose that tested the equilibrium Olive had carefully constructed. A man named Waite arrived in Caldwell claiming to be from a land office in Wichita with papers relating to John's property. The claim, as John explained it to Olive over coffee the following morning, was that there was a dispute about the original land grant recorded in John's father's name, and whether the title transfer at the time of his father's death had been properly filed, and that without the correct documentation, the property might be subject to a competing claim from a land speculator who had been buying up disputed titles across 3 territories. John's expression when he told her was controlled, but she had learned to read beneath his expressions, and what she saw was a man facing the possibility of losing everything he had built. "Show me the papers," she said. He spread them on Prentice's desk, Prentice having been politely displaced from his own office, and Olive read them with the focused attention she brought to every document that crossed her desk. She read them twice. She examined the dates, the signatures, the reference numbers, the specific language used in the disputed claim. Then she sat back and looked at John. "These are not from a land office," she said. He went very still. "What do you mean?" "The seal on the first page is a land office seal, but the reference number it cites does not correspond to any standard federal filing system I am familiar with, and I am familiar with the federal land office filing system, because I spent 2 weeks in March learning it in order to sort out the discrepancy in Garrett's hardware store deed. This seal is copied from something real, but these documents were produced privately." She pointed to a line near the bottom of the second page. "And this clause, the one that gives Waite's office the right to assess the property's current market value for the purpose of determining the disputed claim value, that is not standard language. That is someone setting up a way to make you pay for what is already yours." John's expression had gone somewhere very precise and very quiet that she had not seen before. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not an attorney," she said, "but I am certain enough that before you sign or pay anything, you need a telegram to the actual federal land office in Wichita and the services of a lawyer, and I know the name of a good one in Abilene." He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, which was the first time he had done anything of that nature, and his hand was warm and very large and entirely steady. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when the land is legally confirmed as yours." The telegram to Wichita confirmed within 48 hours that there was no dispute on record regarding John Ashford's property, that his father's title transfer had been properly filed in 1875, and that no one named Waite was associated with the federal land office in any capacity. The lawyer from Abilene arrived by the following Friday, and the matter was presented to Marshal Cobb, who for once appeared to take his responsibilities seriously, and who had Waite escorted out of Caldwell with the advice not to return. John came to find Olive the evening after Waite left town, and she was still in Prentice's back office, writing up a summary of the matter for the records because she believed in having a record of everything. "It is done," he said from the doorway. "I know," she said. "The marshal came by earlier." She finished the line she was writing and set down her pencil and looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Relieved," he said. "And something else I do not have a word for." "What does the something else feel like?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like I wanted to find you first before I felt it properly. Like the relief would not be complete until I told you." The lamp on the desk made a warm circle between them, and outside, the window Caldwell was settling into its evening rhythms, and the whole world felt very specific and very immediate. "John," she said, and was surprised by the sound of his name in her voice, which she did not use often and which she now heard had more in it than she had realized. "Olive," he said, equally quiet, equally weighted. She stood up from the desk and came around it and stopped in front of him, and he looked down at her with an expression of complete and careful openness, and she put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes briefly and then opened them, and looked at her in a way that made the lamp and the office and the whole of Caldwell entirely peripheral. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, neither rushed nor hesitant, thoughtful and genuine, and she felt herself arrive somewhere she had been traveling toward for months without fully acknowledging the destination. When he stepped back, he kept one of her hands in both of his, and he said, I would like to ask you something, and I would like to ask it properly, not in the back of a general store's office." "When," she said. "When you are ready," he said. "I am in no hurry except in every way." She laughed again, and he smiled again, and the evening outside the window was full of stars. He asked her on a Sunday in November, in the small park with the bench and the 2 trees and the remains of the optimistic garden, which had in fact produced a late bloom of something stubborn and yellow before the first frost, and which had remained in the back of Olive's mind as a metaphor she was not certain yet was ready to be named. He had thought about how to ask her. She could tell that in the specificity of what he said, which was not a speech, but was also not an improvisation. He told her that he had spent 31 years building a life that was solid and purposeful, and that had, until recently, felt largely complete in its purposes, and that the previous 8 months had taught him something he had not expected to need to learn, which was that completeness was not the same as fullness, and that he would like very much to build something fuller with her if she would let him. He asked her to marry him. She said yes without any of the deliberation she had promised herself, because the deliberation had already happened across 8 months of walks and letters and coffee and honest conversation, and what was left was only the truth. He put on her finger a ring that had been his mother's, which she had sent from Wichita when he had written to tell her about Olive, and which was a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the November light with a dignity that required no elaboration. They were married in March of 1879, 1 year almost to the week after she had stepped off the stage, and he had righted her trunk in the street. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher at the church on the east end of Main Street, and Nora Fitch stood up with Olive, and the 2 young brothers from the neighboring ranch were there, and Helen Marsh attended and cried in the dignified way of someone who considers tears a reasonable response to a thing done properly. And Prentice was there looking relieved in the way he always looked and wearing a suit that fit him better than his usual clothes. Bill Cord, the widower rancher, sat in the second row and watched the whole thing with an expression of genuine happiness that was quiet and a little sad. And Olive, looking out at the congregation from beside John, saw him and felt a particular tenderness for the people who carry their own grief gracefully enough to still be present for someone else's joy. John's mother came down from Wichita for the wedding. Her name was Margaret, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 60, who looked at Olive with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting a long time and did not intend to waste the assessment. She took Olive's hands in both of hers at the reception at Nora's house and said, "He writes about you as though you are the most sensible person he has ever met." "I take that as a high compliment from him," Olive said. "He has always had more respect for sense than for anything else," Margaret said, "including beauty, which is the correct order of priorities." She squeezed Olive's hands. "He is a good man. He has always been a good man. I worried sometimes that good men get overlooked, but I see I need not have worried in this case." "You need not have," Olive said. She moved her books and her trunk and her $340, somewhat reduced by now, but supplemented by the income she had built out to the ranch on a Tuesday in early April, the sky doing that limitless blue thing again that it did in Kansas when the season turned. John helped her carry everything in from the wagon with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to all physical work, and when everything was inside, she stood in the middle of the sitting room and looked at the bookshelf and the iron stove and the westward-facing porch, and she felt the shape of her future settle around her like a well-made coat. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed from behind her. She turned around and looked at him. "I intend to keep all 3 of my accounts," she said, "and I have been thinking about expanding to proper bookkeeping practice. There are ranchers and businesses in a 40-mile radius who have no one keeping their accounts properly, and the railroad's arrival in the next 2 years will bring more." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about whether the east room of the house could be made into an office." She looked at him. "I measured it last week," he said. "It is large enough for a proper desk and a filing cabinet, and there is a window with good light." She crossed the room and put her hands flat on his chest, and he put his arms around her in that careful, deliberate way of his. And the afternoon light came through the windows, and the Kansas wind was doing whatever it wanted outside. And she thought that this was the thing she had been building toward, and it was everything she had intended it to be, and also, unexpectedly, more. The spring of 1879 brought the things that springs bring in the West: new calves and late mud, and the first runs of travelers on the trail, and the sense of the world shaking itself back into motion after a winter spent being still. Olive rode out with John every morning for the first week of April, getting to know the land in the way that takes physical presence, the specific shape of the hills, and the particular way the water moved in the creek, and the places where the grass was thickest, and what that meant for the summer grazing. She was not a rancher and did not pretend to be. But she was a person who understood systems, and a ranch was a system, and she found that understanding the system made her feel more rooted to the land, and also made her a better partner in the enterprise of running it. She set up her office in the East Room, and within 3 weeks had taken on 2 new clients: a rancher to the southwest, who had been keeping his accounts in a shoebox, literally, a physical shoebox full of receipts and invoices that Olive spent an afternoon sorting into chronological order before she could even begin the actual accounting work, and a small hotel in a town called Axton, 15 miles east, whose proprietor had heard about Olive through Nora and written to ask if she made house calls. She did once a month, and she charged appropriately for the ride. John watched all of this with a satisfaction that she had learned to read in the specific quality of his silence. There was the silence of a man thinking about something difficult, and the silence of a man thinking about nothing in particular, and the silence of a man watching something he is pleased about, and she had learned to distinguish between them in the way you learn to read a landscape, by paying attention to what doesn't change as much as what does. One evening in May she came in from the East Room with her pencil still tucked behind her ear and found him reading at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and she sat down across from him and said, "I want to tell you something." He set the book down. "I have been in Caldwell just over a year," she said. "I want to make sure you know that I am aware of everything that has happened in that year. Not in a listing way, but in a, I have thought about it and I know where I am and why, and it is exactly where I want to be." He looked at her steadily. "Is that something you needed to say or something you needed me to hear?" "Both," she said. He reached across the table and turned her hand palm up and held it. "I know where I am too," he said. "And why?" They sat like that while the evening light changed on the kitchen floor, and outside a meadowlark was doing something complicated and beautiful in the direction of the creek, and Olive thought that she had been right about honest and patient. Both had been required and both had been worth it. The summer of 1879 was dry, as summers in Kansas could be, and the cattle lost some weight to the heat, and the grass went thin in the south pastures by July, and John moved the herd north to the better grazing, and Olive recorded the numbers and watched the weather reports in the newspapers from Wichita, with the attention of someone who understood that the land and the ledger were connected. They had Nora and Helen Marsh out for supper on a Saturday in June, and the 2 young brothers from the neighboring ranch, and Bill Cord came too, and the evening stretched long into the dark with the windows open and the planes doing their night thing, which was different from the day thing in quality but equal in scope. Helen Marsh had a new development about the schoolhouse, which had been completed and supplied with enough books to last 2 years, and which she was now trying to staff with a second teacher because enrollment had grown. Bill Cord mentioned, carefully and then more directly when the table received the information with warmth, that he had been writing to a woman in Missouri who had put an advertisement in the same Abilene paper that Olive had answered, and that he was considering inviting her to come out. "Do it," Nora said immediately. "She may not like the isolation," he said. "Show her Olive," Nora said, nodding toward Olive. Olive came out here alone and built a professional practice and a household, and she does not look isolated to me." Olive raised her coffee cup in acknowledgement. "You should write to her," John said to Bill. "The worst that can happen is she says no, and you are no worse off for having asked." Bill Cord looked at him for a long moment and then nodded slowly. "That is the correct way to look at it," he said. He wrote to the woman in Missouri. Her name was Frances, and she arrived in October, and she was steady and capable, and she and Bill looked at each other at the supper table the night of her arrival with the particular expression of two people who have spent enough time being practical to be surprised when something feels right. They were engaged by Christmas and married in the spring of 1880. Olive helped keep the books for the combined Cord property, which was her wedding gift to them, presented as a year's service without charge. Frances Cord came to her first Wednesday of that year and said, "Nora tells me you are the most important person in the county for what you do." "Nora exaggerates," Olive said. "From what I can see of your accounts," Frances said, looking at the organized files, "she does not." The autumn of 1879 had brought something else besides the dry summer's resolution and the news of Bill Cord's letter to Missouri. It brought the announcement that the railroad was indeed coming closer, a spur line that would reach Caldwell within 2 years, and the land speculation and investment that followed that announcement moved like weather through the territory, changing the economic landscape the way weather changes the physical one. Olive watched this with interest and with caution. She had seen the Waite situation the year before, and she knew that rapid economic change attracted a certain kind of operator who moved faster than the formal structures could respond to. She began keeping notes, not just for her clients but for the general record, a private ledger of her own that tracked the land transactions and business arrangements she observed moving through the county, organized by date and party and amount, a kind of economic weather map. John asked her about it once when he found the private ledger on her desk. "Insurance," she said. "If something looks wrong, I will have the record to show what was wrong and when I noticed it. Do you think something is going to look wrong?" "Not necessarily," she said, "but I believe in records." "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I most admire about you." She looked at the ledger and then at him. "There is a land deal forming around the property north of the Harker claim. 3 separate transactions in the past 6 weeks, all involving the same agent in Wichita, all just below the threshold that would require a county recording fee. Individually, they mean nothing. Together, they suggest someone is assembling a parcel and does not want it formally noticed." He sat down across from her and looked at the notes she had made. He asked several precise questions. She answered them. "Should we tell someone?" he said. "I am going to write to the Territorial Land Office," she said, "officially and with copies for our own records." She wrote the letter the following morning. The Territorial Land Office responded 3 weeks later confirming that the transactions were under review and thanking her for the organized documentation. The assembly of parcels turned out to be a speculative scheme that was not technically illegal, but that would have displaced 2 long-established farming families from land they had worked for a decade. By running their water rights through a series of paper transactions to a holding company that would then have leverage to negotiate unfavorable terms. The review she prompted ended that process before it completed. One of the farming families came to her personally to say thank you. They were a husband and wife named Delmont in their 40s, both weathered and specific in the way of people who have spent their lives doing real work. The woman, Sarah Delmont, gripped both of Olive's hands across the desk and said something in a low, direct voice that stayed with Olive for years. "People with your skill," Sarah Delmont said, "mostly use it for themselves or for the people who are already powerful. You used it for us. We will not forget that." Olive thought about that a great deal. She thought about what she had originally said to Prentice, more than a year before, that honest bookkeeping could function as a form of protection. And she thought about how that principle extended beyond any one client. She began, quietly and without announcement, to offer reduced-rate accounting services to 2 of the smaller ranching operations near Caldwell. the ones run by people who were clearly working hard, but clearly had no financial education and no framework for understanding when they were being taken advantage of. She structured the fees to be minimal enough to maintain the professional relationship, not enough to be a burden. John knew about this before she told him, because he had been watching her accounts and she had known he was watching them and had not minded because she trusted the way he watched. "You are giving away work," he said one evening. "I am choosing what to charge," she said. "That is a form of ownership." He considered this. "Two of your discounted clients are also in supply chains that connect to Garrett's hardware account. If you have all three, you have visibility across almost all the goods movement in the county's southern half." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You are building something bigger than a bookkeeping practice," he said. "I am building something more useful," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother came to Texas from nothing and built everything through the same principle, that being useful to people who needed it came back to you differently than being useful to people who didn't need you." "Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked," Olive said. "She would have liked you very much," he said. "She would have argued with you about several things and liked you for it." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard in the way Kansas winters can be hard, which is completely and without apology. The temperature dropped in late November and stayed down for weeks, and the ranch work became the concentrated business of keeping animals alive and pipes from freezing and the woodpile replenished. And Olive found that she liked the closed quality of winter, the way it made the house into a world complete in itself. She read John's Emerson by the fire and started a correspondence with a woman in St. Louis who wrote about economic justice in terms that were familiar from her own practice but more formally articulated. And she spent evenings working on her private ledger and her accounts and thinking about the shape the spring would take. John read to her sometimes in the evenings, which she had not expected, and which she loved with an uncomplicated completeness. The specific experience of his voice, which was deep and measured, reading words that someone else had made, while the fire did what fires do, and the wind moved around the house with its familiar nighttime voice. They talked in those winter evenings more than they had in the busier seasons, when the work of the world was always pressing from outside. They talked about his father and what the man had been difficult and loving in the same breath, demanding in ways that had sometimes been unfair, and that John had needed years to separate from the genuine lessons buried inside them. They talked about Olive's mother, who had died when Olive was 15, and what that had made of her, which was someone who built things because building was what you did when the thing you were supposed to lean on was gone. They talked about the territory and the way it was changing, and what that change meant for the people who had been here longest, including the communities whose claim to the land predated any deed or title by generations. John had thoughts about this that were more considered than she had expected. He knew several men from the Wichita and affiliated tribes reservation to the south, men he had traded with and talked with over years, and he spoke about them with the specific respect of someone who had listened rather than assumed. He talked about the injustice of the displacement policies plainly, and without the defensive qualifications she had heard from other people who acknowledged the injustice, but surrounded it with enough qualifications to effectively reduce it to nothing. "It is wrong," he said simply. The land was taken by a process that was legal by the laws of the people doing the taking and entirely without the consent of the people it was being taken from. The legal structure does not make it just. "No," she said, "it does not. I do not know what to do about it that would be sufficient," he said, "but I try not to add to it and I try to be honest about what it is." "That is more than most people manage," she said. "It is not enough," he said, "but it is what I have." She thought about the Delmont family and the discounted accounts and the private ledger. She thought about how the tools she had, numbers, records, visibility into the movements of money and land, could be useful in ways she had not fully articulated yet. She did not have the answer to the larger injustice John was describing, and she was honest enough not to pretend she did. But she thought about it through that winter, and the thinking shaped the way she used her tools in the years that followed. In February of 1880, Olive discovered she was expecting a child. She told John on a cold Tuesday morning when the light was clear and blue through the kitchen window, and the coffee was hot, and the world outside was very still. She told him directly, sitting at the table with both hands around her cup, and she watched his face go through something that was too large and too fast to name any single part of it. He set down his cup and came around the table and crouched in front of her and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that was the fullest she had ever seen from him, which was saying something. "Olive," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "I am entirely well and entirely glad, and I thought you should know this morning." He held her hands very carefully, and after a moment he said, "I need a moment." "Take it," she said. He sat back against the wall beside her chair and was quiet for several minutes, and she drank her coffee and watched the blue light change on the kitchen floor and let him have his moment. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said. "I am very glad," he said, and his voice was different from how it usually was, and she understood that she was hearing the place in him that did not get words often. "Good," she said. "So am I." She wrote to Margaret Ashford in Wichita that afternoon, and Margaret came down the following month and stayed for 2 weeks and was everything a grandmother in waiting is supposed to be, which is to say she was opinionated and useful in equal measure, and she and Olive argued productively about several things and agreed about most of the important ones. The summer of 1880 was easier than 1879, the rain more generous and the grass coming in well. And John expanded the herd by 40 head, and Olive expanded her bookkeeping practice to include a 4th regular client, and finished the first full year's review of the private economic ledger she had been keeping, which was substantial enough by now to function as a genuine reference document for the county's financial patterns. She worked through the summer at a pace she maintained as reasonable and at her own judgment, which she declined to allow other people's anxiety to revise. She was healthy and energetic, and the work gave her something that pregnancy, for all its wonders, could not, which was the particular satisfaction of a problem precisely solved. Their son was born on a September morning in 1880, delivered by the town's doctor, who had ridden out the night before when it became clear the time was coming. He was large, which the doctor attributed to his father with a professional frankness that made John, who had been pacing the porch for 4 hours, stop pacing long enough to look uncertain about how to respond. They named him Samuel, for John's father and for the quality of the name itself, which was solid and unpretentious, and had a long history of being useful. Olive held him in the morning light and felt something that she could not put in a ledger, which was fine. There were things in the world that did not need quantifying. She had always known this, but Samuel made the point with a completeness that was entirely new. John sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them with an expression she stored away in the best part of her memory, the part she intended to keep. Samuel grew the way babies in the West grow, quickly and with great interest in the world, and Olive returned to her work within weeks because the work was hers, and she was not going to surrender it, and because John had built the East Room office to suit exactly this situation, the baby near enough to hear and the desk available, and the two things coexisting rather than competing. Nora visited every week and held Samuel with the practiced ease of someone who was an excellent aunt in all but formal title. Helen Marsh visited and held Samuel precisely once, declared him adequate, and returned to a long speech about the school's reading program that was her way of expressing affection. Frances and Bill Cord came with their own news in November. Frances was expecting in the spring, and the four of them sat on John and Olive's porch with coffee and blankets as the autumn evening came in and talked about the things that were changing and the things that were not. The railroad came to Caldwell in 1881, and the change it brought was as significant as Olive had anticipated. New businesses, new settlers, new money, and the new friction that money always brings when it moves into a space that has developed its own rhythms. She was ready for it. The private ledger had given her a clear picture of the county's economic patterns before the change, and she could track the alterations precisely, which was useful both for her clients and for the general record. She took on 2 new clients in the first month of the railroad's operation, both of them businesses that had come in with the new traffic. She was, by this point, the most comprehensive independent account keeper in the county, and possibly in the surrounding territory, which she did not make a particular point of advertising, because she had found that doing the work spoke more clearly than any announcement. Prentice told her one afternoon with the resignation of someone acknowledging a fact of nature, "You could buy this store 3 times over if you wanted to." "I do not want to buy your store," she said. "I want to keep your accounts. They are more interesting." He seemed simultaneously relieved and deflated, and she was fond of him for it. In the spring of 1882, she had a second child, a daughter they named Clara, not after John's former engagement but after John's grandmother, whose name happened to be the same. Clara arrived without difficulty, and with a full set of opinions that she expressed consistently from the first hour, which made everyone who knew Olive smile in a knowing way that Olive chose to accept as a compliment. Samuel was 18 months old and extremely interested in the new development, which he expressed by sitting very close to wherever Clara was, and watching her with the serious attention of someone taking on a significant responsibility. The spring and summer of 1882 were full in the way that life with 2 children and a thriving practice and a cattle ranch is full, which is to say they were genuinely full, not the performance of fullness but the real thing. There were difficult days and easy ones, days when the accounts would not balance and days when they balanced beautifully, days when the cattle were in trouble and days when everything moved as it should, days when the children were both well and one of them was not, and the house required a kind of management that had nothing to do with ledgers. Through all of it John remained himself, which was the quality she had noticed first and which had, if anything, deepened. He had always been present in the way that large things are present, but what she had come to understand across 4 years of marriage was that his presence was not a function of his size but of his attention. He was there, genuinely there, in the specific way of someone who has decided that being present is the most important thing they can offer the people in their life. He moved through their shared world the same way he had moved out of her way on that first day in Caldwell, with the awareness that how he occupied space mattered, and the considered choice to occupy it in a way that made room for the people beside him. She told him this one evening when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, when they were sitting on the westward porch watching the sun go out over the plains in the particular long Kansas way. "I want you to know something," she said. He looked at her. "I have been thinking about the day I arrived, when you righted my trunk." "I remember," he said. "Every man on that street watched it fall," she said, "and you were the only one who moved. And when you had picked it up, you moved out of my way so I could pass. I thought about that for days. I could not stop thinking about it." "It seemed like the obvious thing to do," he said. "That is exactly why I could not stop thinking about it," she said. "Because for the obvious thing to be kindness, a person has to be built a certain way, and you are built that way down to the foundation." He was quiet for a moment. The light was orange and low over the grass. "You have been the best thing I have built anything alongside," he said. "I want you to know that." She put her hand on his forearm and felt the solid warmth of him beside her and the whole of the evening spread out in front of them, the plains going dark slowly, the first stars appearing at the edge of the sky. "I do know it," she said. "That is what I am trying to tell you." They sat there as the stars multiplied above them, and the night insects started up in the grass, and somewhere out in the dark, a night bird was calling in the direction of the creek. and the house behind them held its small sounds of children sleeping and fire settling, and the tick of the clock on the kitchen shelf. Olive thought about Ohio and did not miss it. She thought about the stage and the trunk and the street and the moment he had turned toward her, and the chain of mornings and evenings and arguments, and laughter and honest letters and hard seasons and good ones that had run from that moment to this. And she thought that she had been right about what that single action had told her, back before she noticed anything else. It had told her exactly who he was. And who he was had turned out to be, without qualification or reservation, the right person. In 1883, she incorporated her bookkeeping practice formally, one of the first women in the territory to do so, and the certificate of incorporation that the territorial office sent back was framed and hung on the wall of the East Room office beside the window with the good light. Samuel, who was 3 years old by then, liked to look at it because it had an official seal on it, and he was at the age where official seals were among the most impressive things in the world. His father lifted him up to see it more than once and explained what it meant, and Samuel listened with the serious attention he had been born with, and then said that he wanted a seal too. "You will need to build something first," John told him. "What should I build?" Samuel asked. John looked at Olive. "Something useful," Olive said. "Start with something useful and see what grows from it." Samuel thought about this for a moment and then announced that he was going to build a house for the barn cat, which was, Olive thought, the correct instinct and a good beginning. Clara, at 18 months, was interested in the certificate primarily as something to point at, which she did with great conviction, and John said she had her mother's certainty about important documents, which made Olive laugh so suddenly and so completely that Samuel dropped the barn cat, and the cat left the room with an expression of profound dignity. The years that followed were the years of building, which is what years are when you have done the foundational work. The ranch grew by careful expansion, John adding land when the price was right and the land was good, and by the mid-1880s, he was one of the more substantial cattle operations in the county, without having become the kind of operation that required giving up the personal management that made it worth running. Olive's practice grew in parallel, and the private ledger, which she had maintained for 6 years by 1885, had become a resource that the county's newly established bank consulted when they needed a picture of the economic landscape before making lending decisions. She was not officially employed by the bank. She was a consultant, which meant she was independent, which was exactly what she had always wanted. Nora Fitch expanded the millinery into a dry goods operation in 1884, and Olive helped her structure the expansion and negotiate the financing and laughed when Nora's new supplier turned out to be the same Wichita firm that had been overcharging Prentice in 1878 and wrote the renegotiation letter herself. Nora sent her flowers. Helen Marsh got a second school teacher, and then a third, and then the school became the largest elementary establishment in the county, and she was quietly and extremely pleased about this and celebrated by assigning more reading. Frances and Bill Cord had 3 children over the years, and the 2 families visited often across the 4 seasons, and the Cord kitchen and the Ashford porch were the 2 places where the world felt most reliably like what the world should be. Samuel started school in 1885 and came home with questions that took the whole evening to work through, and Clara started 2 years after that with a confidence that impressed Helen Marsh, which was not an easy thing to do. In the summer of 1887, there was one more difficult situation, which the world produces with a regularity that prevents any extended period of unqualified ease. A drought that had been building across the plains for 2 years hit the county with full force, and the cattle losses were significant for every operation in the area, including theirs. The summer was hot and dry, and the grass came in thin, and the creek ran low, and the mood in town was the particular flat anxiety of people looking at the gap between what they have and what they need. Olive's private ledger was more useful than ever that summer, because She could see clearly which operations were genuinely at risk and which were losing money but had enough reserve to survive the year. And the difference was important for the bank's decisions about where to extend credit and where to pull back. And she made those recommendations with the directness she had always brought to her work. John sold 30 head in July at prices that were lower than he liked to prevent the losses from going deeper, which was a hard decision made correctly. They talked through the numbers together at the kitchen table in the way they had always talked through hard things, which was directly and with full information, and without the kind of protective softening that people sometimes use on each other in hard times and that she had always believed did more harm than good. "We will be shorter this year," he said. "Yes," she said, "but the base is solid and the herd can rebuild in 2 seasons if the grass comes back." "When will it come back?" "I do not know," she said. "I am a bookkeeper, not a meteorologist. But the historical patterns in the ledger suggest this kind of drought has run 2 to 3 years before breaking in the past." "We are in year 2, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They managed the shortfall, and in 1888 the rains returned and the grass came back and the herd rebuilt on the schedule she had estimated, and she had the particular satisfaction of a prediction confirmed by evidence, which was a satisfaction she did not tire of no matter how many times it happened. Samuel was 8 years old that year and had developed the beginning of his father's quality of deliberate action and his mother's quality of precise attention to detail, which was, everyone agreed, either a very effective combination or a very demanding one, depending on what the detail in question was. Clara was 6 and was everything a 6-year-old is allowed to be, which is energetic and specific and absolutely certain of her own opinions. One evening in the autumn of 1888, with the children in bed and the harvest in and the accounts balanced for the quarter and the west porch doing its thing with the sunset, Olive sat beside John and felt the whole of it at once, not as a review or a summary, but as a present thing, the specific weight and warmth of a life that had been built deliberately and was genuinely what she had wanted it to be. She had come to Caldwell with a traveling trunk and $340 and a letter about an accounting position, and she had built from those materials something that could not be put in a ledger but that she understood as thoroughly as any ledger she had ever kept. "What are you thinking?" John asked. "I am thinking that the life we have built is a very good one," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The light was going gold and then orange over the plains. A hawk was doing wide circles above the south pasture. "It is," he said. "It is a very good one." "I want to say one more thing," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "Thank you for being exactly what you are," she said. "Not for what you have done or what you provide or any of the practical things, though those matter. For being exactly the kind of person who picks up a stranger's trunk and moves out of her way. I want you to know that I have never stopped noticing that." He turned to look at her, and his expression was the full one, the one that had no performance in it. "You are the best thing that has ever walked through any of my days," he said. "And I am going to keep on being exactly what I am for as long as I can manage it, because it seems to be working." She put her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sun finish its day above the Kansas plains, the grass going dark in the failing light, the first stars coming up in the east the way they always came, steady and indifferent and beautiful, the way the world is beautiful when you have found the right place to stand in it. Inside the house, Samuel slept the deep sleep of a boy who had spent the day doing important work with a barn cat's new house, and Clara slept the certain sleep of someone who knew exactly who she was and intended to continue being it. And the clock on the kitchen shelf counted the evening out in its quiet, regular way, and the fire had been banked for the night, and the east room with its good window waited for the morning. Outside on the porch, Olive Atwood, who was now Olive Ashford and had been for 9 years, sat beside the largest man in 3 territories and felt the rightness of it settle around her like something that had been built to last, which it had, and which it would, right through every season that followed. The night came in soft over the plains, and the stars multiplied, and the hawk was gone to wherever hawks go in the dark, and the wind moved through the grass with its old familiar voice, and everything that had needed to be built was built, and everything that had needed to be said had been said, and the two of them sat in the particular piece of people who have done the work and know what they have, which is everything.